Welcome to week 2 of World Religions. In this video, I'll essentially talk through the assignments that are due next Sunday night and maybe just make more clear some of the content that is included in the Word document posted on D2L that you will receive by email, the agenda for week 2. Basically, the agenda includes the links to videos to watch and states what the assignments are. And the assignments are posted on D2L. The videos are a short video, What Counts as Religion, 14 minutes long. This video of me. And then 2 videos involving atheistic Satanism. That might sound bizarre. We'll get on to why Satanism has absolutely any relevance with regard to the question, what counts as religion. Maybe I've given it away in saying it's atheistic Satanism. Does that count as religion since it's atheistic? So the overall question is what counts as religion, clearly. And this is largely motivated by the fact that dictionary definitions can be woefully inadequate. When students are asked to define religion, they'll often find definitions such as the belief in and worship of a superhuman controlling power, especially a personal god or gods. It may seem like a fairly adequate definition of religion, except that there are forms of religion that do not have any concept of a god or gods. There are atheistic forms of religion, as counterintuitive as that might seem. And we'll see that especially when we study Buddhism. Many forms of Buddhism involve no concept of God or gods. Furthermore, that definition of religion specifies that the personal god or gods is a controlling power. Well, that would raise serious questions about suffering and pain and evil and tragedy, depending, of course, what we mean by controlling. But it just doesn't make sense to assume that all forms of religion believe in a god who manages, much less micromanages the universe. And we'll talk about some specific forms of religion that believe almost the opposite of that. So that definition is woefully inadequate, largely because of this question of God. The quiz this week will ask about forms of belief in God, or forms of theism. Theism simply means belief in God. But clearly there are lots of forms of theism. And by that I don't mean Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism. There are forms of isms that include many of these religions, and some of which exist within any given religion. So monotheism is belief in one God. The major monotheistic religions of the world would include Christianity, Judaism, Islam. There are other monotheistic religions. That's not an exclusive list by any means. They largely come from the Abrahamic tradition, the biblical tradition. So that's belief in one God, monotheism. And then polytheism is another fairly well-known designation, belief in the existence of many gods. One that's less well-known might be henotheism. And these definitions are in the agenda document, by the way. Henotheism is belief in the existence of many gods while worshipping only one of them, who may be regarded as a supreme god. That might sound bizarre, but it's an evolutionary stage in the emergence of monotheism. So roughly speaking, I think it's fair to say, especially in the context of the Judeo-Christian tradition, that if we go far enough back in the origins of ancient Israel, the peoples of ancient Israel were at one point largely polytheistic, in the sense that they believed in the existence of multiple gods. They believed that each tribe had its own god, and these gods were like warring mascots who would fight on behalf of the tribes. So the tribes fought over land, livestock, wealth, women, whatever. They believed the gods were fighting too. And they tended to attribute their victory or their failure to the success or otherwise of their god. So this was the kind of religion against which Abraham reacts in the book of Genesis, in leaving Ur. But even though traditionally Abraham is considered the father of monotheism and may have rejected polytheism, he wasn't a monotheist in the full sense of the word. He was this in-between stage, henotheist, because he still believed that the enemy tribes had their gods who were a real threat. And that persists well into the Old Testament, so that, for example, there are psalms that praise God as being a victor above all gods, and God vanquishing God's enemies. The idea that there were, in this worldview, still other gods, maybe we're not going to call them small g gods, who did ontologically exist and did pose a threat to Yahweh. However, Israel began to regard Yahweh as superior to these gods, and hence they'd worship only Yahweh. They had a covenant or a contract with Yahweh. They'd only worship Yahweh and avoided idolatry, avoided the worship of these other gods. But these other gods were still taken seriously as supernatural entities that existed. Mal and Baal, Marduk. Interestingly, some of these gods were gradually relegated in the Israelite imagination from being gods and were eventually regarded as demons. I mean, really, where is the dividing line between a demon and a god? We're talking about supernatural, disembodied entities in both cases. So a good case in point would be Baal, the pagan god Baal, eventually is relegated in Jewish thought to Beelzebub. Beelzebub is translated variously as Lord of the House, is a kind of very polite and charitable translation of Beelzebub. Another version of it, though, is a slur on the god Baal, Lord of the Flies, or more graphically, Lord of the Dung Heap, which is quite indelicate, isn't it? Basically, it's the people of ancient Israel saying to the worshippers of Baal, your god is a pile of SH1T, essentially. But even more broadly than that, the gods of the pagan world were gradually thought of as demons by the ancient Israelites and by the early Christians later on. Some of the early Christians thought Zeus was more or less the same thing as Satan, which made for lovely relations between the early Christians and their pagan colleagues, as you can imagine. Anyhow, that's henotheism, believing that lots of gods exist, but only worshipping one of them, having a loyalty to that god, and perhaps regarding that god as a supreme god. And then there's agnosticism, you may be familiar with it, not knowing whether or not there is a god, a kind of undecided position. And agnosticism can be a kind of personal agnosticism, where a person might just say, I'm at a point in my life and at a point in my studies, education, life experience, where I am not sure whether there's a god or not. A kind of personal decision. Whereas there's also philosophical agnosticism, which would take the stance that we cannot know whether or not there is a god, that this question is beyond the limits of human knowledge and understanding, so that nobody could ever be sure of it. So there are both forms of agnosticism. Then there's pantheism. Pan as in earth. In some ways it's an ancient worldview, the idea that nature is essentially God, or that some component of nature, forest, tree, or waterfall, is God. But you could argue that pantheism has re-emerged in some forms of New Age thought. There are forms of spirituality that really make no distinction between the earth or the world, the universe, and its creator. Now that can sound very attractive in the sense that it can nurture a high regard for nature and perhaps seems to fit very well with ecological concern. But philosophically it does cause problems. If nature is God, well, nature is red in tooth and claw. It's vicious. I mean, it's nature that includes the food chain and the extinction of whole species and the horrible suffering of individual creatures and cancer and tornadoes and tsunamis. So if nature is God, are the forces of nature identical with God? So God literally massacres hundreds of thousands of people. So pantheism, making no distinction between the earth and God, would have to equate God with the forces that bring about such suffering and destruction. Whereas theism, in its various forms, often regards God as creator, but would argue that God doesn't micromanage the world, so not everything that happens is God's doing. And in the Christian tradition, there's the idea of original sin or the fall, that something went wrong. after God created the world. So the world as we encounter it today, the world we see reported on the news, with all of the injustice and horror and tragedy, is not what God wanted to create. It's not a divine blueprint. It's a twisted form of the world. And in the Christian tradition, the world is seen as both holy and good, essentially, but simultaneously as fallen, which gets God off the hook, to some extent at least, for the creation of evil and injustice and suffering. And that's pantheism. Then another theism is anatheism. It's not widely spoken about. It's a philosophical construct. Anatheism is belief in God, but it's a modern form of belief in God that takes very seriously the objections of atheism and refines its belief in God so as to respond to atheism. So it doesn't abandon its belief in God, but often anatheists would say that they've come to the point where they've just had to let go of the idea of some kind of omniscient, all-knowing, all-powerful alpha God who lives in the clouds and could swoop in and solve all the problems of the world if God so wished, and for some mysterious reason just does not. Anatheists have often let go of that and would argue that God isn't some kind of super being, but rather God is closer to being itself. God is closer to the ground or platform that allows everything else to exist and works through us, essentially, rather than as some kind of Christian version of Zeus or Thor who can swoop in and solve everything if God so wanted. So it's a sophisticated idea of God. It doesn't let go of belief in God, but it moves beyond God as a kind of superhuman, or God as some kind of being that exists in some hidden recess of the universe, and says God is beyond that, beyond human language, beyond human thought. We have very limited concepts and words to describe God, but it still is a commitment to belief in God. And then, of course, there's atheism, which is the position that there is no God. So it is a form of belief, and it's quite a certain form of belief in saying that there is no God. And I think it's reasonable to argue that there's a burden of proof that falls on atheism, just as a burden of proof falls on the various forms of theism. An atheist might argue that there is no empirical proof that there's a God, but is the God that theists believe in really some kind of physical entity that could ever be empirically proven? Especially in anatheism, God is well beyond some kind of physical entity, well beyond, you could say, the competence and scope of the hard sciences, just as scientific questions are well beyond the competence and scope of theology and philosophy. So there's a burden of proof that falls on atheism to somehow defend its certainty that there is no form of God. That's a fairly high claim. It doesn't just deny certain claims about God in Christianity or in Hinduism or Sikhism or something, but it says there's no God. And the absence of proof is not proof of absence necessarily. There's nothing neutral about atheism as a kind of default fallback position. That can be a wrong assumption, that the assumption that there's no God is somehow far more objective and far more neutral than any other position, because it is a position in its own right, and one which is arguably beyond the scope of science. Science can say very little, in the sense of hard science, about the God question. So they're forms of belief in God, and so much for that definition of religion about belief in the gods and a controlling superpower. Many of these are very, very much at odds with that definition, and yet they can represent forms of religion. So all of these isms are in the Word document. So that's assessed by a multiple choice quiz this week, these forms of belief in God. Then the second deliverable this week is a discussion board about what counts as religion. There are two videos, or links for two videos, about atheistic Satanism that would be a good stimulus for this discussion. I don't want to preempt everything in the videos, of course. Safe to say that when people think of Satanism, if their imagination is largely fueled by Hollywood, they may think of hooded figures in a cemetery or deep in a forest in the middle of the night, performing unspeakable acts on black cats or stolen children or prostitutes or the Eucharist stolen from a Christian church. And they may have this very ritualized idea of Satanism. Now, it's difficult to make a sweeping statement and say that that absolutely does not exist in the US. Who knows what's going on with some disturbed teenagers in some dark corner of a forest. But we can say that the largest Satanist denominations reject that kind of Satanism. The largest branches of Satanism in this country would be the Satanic Temple and the Church of Satan. These are atheistic Satanists. They don't believe in God and they don't believe in Satan, in a sense. They don't believe that Satan exists as an ontological being. They don't believe there's a spirit, some kind of disembodied intelligence floating around somewhere in the universe with agency. They think of Satan as a symbol, but as an extremely important symbol. A symbol of the ego and the will to power that will not cower before the demands of other people. It's a form of reaction to the Christian call to service and to other-centeredness to some extent. It's the idea that Satan is a kind of hero. Satan represents the being who stood up against a tyrannical God and said, I will not serve, non serviam. This a precedent in John Milton's Paradise Lost to some extent for this. Milton seemed to present Satan in a fairly sympathetic manner, where God is depicted as somewhat tyrannical. Satan, unlike the other, as he depicts some sheepish angels, says, nope, I'm not going to bow down, I'm not going to prostrate myself before God and be servile. And hence Satanists adopt this symbol of the courageous, strong individual who will not cower and bend down to any authority, not even a god. Now, they don't believe this being exists as an ontological spirit, but in a sense they believe they can be Satan, that Satan represents this strong will to power and individualism in every person. They do use the statuary and the imagery because they recognize the power of aesthetics. They represent the power of having these pictures of Satan. And one of the videos you'll see is a dispute about wanting to have a statue of a demon positioned outside a public building alongside some Judeo-Christian symbolism. Well, it raises the question, are they a religion? Does their movement count as a religion? When I say they, atheistic Satanists. The Church of Satan describes itself as a church. The Satanic Temple, a temple. It involves rituals to an extent. They do have rituals and ceremonies, but as I say, it's because of the psychological benefit of these. Not that they think they're communicating with some kind of a being. In fact, the Church of Satan on its website has a comment that if you contact them because you believe that you've had encounters with demons or evil spirits, they recommend that you contact a mental health professional instead. So they're quite opposed to that kind of thinking about Satan. So the discussion board raises this question: does this form of religion count as religion when it has no belief in God or the disembodied? As I mentioned earlier, forms of Buddhism may similarly have no idea of God per se. So God isn't such a universal concept in religion. You might say the idea of the sacred is, but what do we mean by the sacred? For some religions, the sacred means some disembodied supernatural realm. For others, the sacred pervades everything. That every morsel and molecule of creation is sacred. And for others, sacred means set apart. Perhaps raising the question why some things have to be set apart from others if one believes in a God who created everything. Did God create some things sacred and some things not so sacred? So in the discussion board, I'll ask you to comment on what counts as religion. Let me, before I finish, I'll give you a few criteria that could be helpful in that. And you could apply these criteria to the case of atheistic Satanism or to any form, any organization, any ideology. Because on this discussion board, feel free to try out something a little bit original, perhaps, and test out whether something not typically regarded as a religion could be described as a religion. So, for example, I'll include an article that suggests this. There are people who feel they've worked for employers whose organisation is quasi-religious, maybe even cult-like. And in a future week, we will talk about that C word, cult, with all its pejorative connotations. And you've probably come across people who feel, or might have had the experience of working for a big organisation with its own language, its own weird rituals and structures and mores, or even smaller organisations that may seem quasi-religious. Is BLM in any sense a religion? It has rituals, you could argue, couldn't we? It definitely has a set of beliefs. We could also look at very sinister groups and ask if they count as religions as well. Some of the little cult-like groups on the fringes, some of the supremacist groups perhaps, even Nazism had rituals and had symbols and mantras to an extent. Could they count as a religion? Sometimes a group will present itself as a religion for financial gain. There's an argument that the Church of Scientology here in the US presents itself as a church in a country where churches have tax-exempt status, whereas, at least until recently, Scientology in Europe tended to present itself in a more secular way. It didn't call itself the Church of Scientology, it called itself Dianetics, and presented itself as a self-help movement to help people purge themselves of their faults, essentially, so as to become more perfect and eventually Thetans. So sometimes there are all kinds of agendas for presenting a group as a religion or not. And people might be surprised as to what a religion. I mean, some people probably think that the Salvation Army is only a charity, whereas it is a Christian denomination and has its own beliefs and doctrines and ministers and its own worship. Anyhow, so here are some criteria that you could use in the discussion when you're deciding whether something does or does not count as a religion. Whether it's atheistic Satanism or whether it's Whole Foods or Lush or whatever. They're off the cuff. I'm not making any judgment about those companies. They're all C words. The first one is creed or beliefs or doctrines. Does the organisation have a set of beliefs? So for Christianity, it would be the existence of God, the idea that Jesus Christ is fully human and fully divine. For Hindus, the creed would involve reincarnation. For Buddhists, it would involve certain beliefs about suffering. So does the group have creed, shared beliefs? A second criteria is code, meaning moral teachings, which of course flow from creed and not entirely separate. So in the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Ten Commandments, and there are Christian teachings about sexual ethics, everything from poverty to immigration to abortion to war. These would fall within the realm of code. A third C word, cult. Now, I earlier said that can have very negative connotations, and it can. I mean, to call a group a cult per se is rarely very flattering. However, there's another sense of the word cult. Cult can also mean the ritual, ceremonial, symbolic side of a religion. So within Catholicism, we might talk about the cult of the Virgin Mary. And that does not mean weird hooded figures running around to worship Mary. It means a tradition of devotion to Mary. A little bit like the secular sense of the word cult. A cult movie, for example. If we hear of cult movie, it might call to mind strangely dressed people going to the Rocky Horror Picture Show somewhere in Virginia Highlands. It's a cult movie, or some of the Tarantino movies might be called cult movies. People will have paraphernalia to do with it, ashtrays, posters, to do with Pulp Fiction, for example, or other movies that have, as I say, a kind of a cult following. So cult doesn't have to be pejorative. You can denote a kind of a following and a sense of ritual and symbolism. So we've had creed, code, and cult, or two more. Canon. Canon refers to the set of writings or texts, though it could be an oral canon associated with the religion. Anything from the Torah to the Bible to the Quran to the Book of Mormon would be canon. Now, when we try to stretch religion, as I say, to maybe include a corporation, they have no shortage of texts. They'll even have mission statements. Doesn't the word mission statement have very religious undertones? So many of these you may find apply to groups not normally thought of as religions. Maybe especially they may be open to being called religions if they expect their employees to make this the center of their lives and put it before their families and before their leisure, before if everything you do has to be about the company, the firm. That might be a hint that there is a quasi-religious dimension to it. So canon is texts, stories, writings. And then lastly, community. What structure does the community take? Is it very horizontal or hierarchical? Are there very set ways of interacting? I mean, we get all kinds of structures within religions. I think we could argue that Roman Catholicism is a very hierarchical religion in the sense that it's a global religion, so it has structures that range from local parishes like the Catholic Church in Lawrenceville to the Diocese of Atlanta to the bishops in the US and then eventually the Pope and the Vatican. Whereas other groups like the Quakers and Mennonites have a much more horizontal structure where there isn't a separate clergy and anybody within the group can preach and can lead prayer, anybody of any gender. Maybe there are age restrictions. I should qualify that. So creed, code, cult and community. If you can find a group that has, there's no magic number. It's not like you've got 3 out of 5 you're a religion. It's debatable as to whether you can say all of these apply to any group or whether 2 apply or 3 apply. But they are loose hallmarks of religion. A group that had none of them could hardly be called a religion. So there were no shared beliefs, no creed, no shared morality, no code, and no kind of symbolism at all or sense of ritual at all, no cult, and it had no shared writings, had no canon, and no structure for a community. That's hardly a religion. So that might be helpful for the discussion board. And as I say, don't be afraid to be controversial. Now that said, I'm not inviting people to be scathingly critical of groups. But this isn't calling for scathing criticism. It's calling for a discussion as to whether a group could count as a religion or not. This is not to say that the group is a cult necessarily in the pejorative sense, just because it might arguably have features of a religion. So I think this can be done in a respectful way, but still in a critical way. As I say, don't feel the need to confine yourself to actual recognised religions, but by all means, I mean, this could be applied to an established, recognised world religion. So they're the deliverables, the quiz on the isms, the quiz on monotheism, agnosticism, atheism, pantheism, etc. And the discussion board asking what counts as a religion. Perhaps invoking the atheistic Satanism example, or any group, and perhaps using these 5 C words as hallmarks as to what might and might not count as a religion. So I hope that's some help for this week, our topic, what counts as religion. And I very much look forward to reading the discussion posts. Don't hesitate to reach out if I can help in any way. Use email, or there are the 2 office hours by Zoom, Wednesday at 2:30 and Saturday at 11. And I'll stay on for about 30 minutes each time if there's nobody else there. But I can stay on as long as necessary if there are people on the call and they need longer than half an hour. People have come to all of them so far, and as I say, half an hour has covered it. So maybe don't show up like an hour after 2:30. I may be gone by then. Try and be there 2:30 or close to it, just in case nobody else is on. But if I'm gone, email me and we can always have one-on-one Zoom calls. So for example, if it's about somebody's grades and they don't want to do it in a public forum, we can do that, and we can use email as well. Don't hesitate to raise any issues about the technology. People have been very good about doing that and very patient. When they discovered that all of their grades were being dropped, for example, because there's some default setting that wanted to drop 10 items in each category. So thank you to those who exposed that little glitch, and people who early on who couldn't see the discussion. That was invaluable to know. It's great to find out that before 11:59 on Sunday night when the thing was due. That would have been quite stressful for everybody. So thank you so much, and don't hesitate to reach out if I can do anything at all. Thanks.